G'day, I'm Owen. Welcome to the Pub Test, and in this one we are looking at a true crime case in Western Australia. And these events happened in the 1960s in the capital of Perth. Now, Western Australia is a beautiful place to go and visit. It's quite a large state, obviously. It's got some beautiful beaches all up and down the coast. But Perth has always been the central hub of Western Australia. And it was really flourishing in the 1960s. But some really weird events happened there. So let's have a look at these events. And at the end, we'll put it to the pub test. Firstly, I have to state that if you are familiar with the Nightcaller or Nedland's Monster, as this particular person who was perpetrating crimes was known as, then hang around because I will be asking some different questions at the end. But if you are not familiar with this, then settle in because we are going to be going on quite the journey with a few twists along the way. But I will have to state at the start, viewer discretion is advised. We are talking about some fairly heavy topics. And maybe some of my views, which are my own opinions, might be a little bit controversial. But we'll start with John Button. Now, he was born in Liverpool in 1943. Now, I suggest that his family emigrated out to Australia very quickly and settled in Western Australia and Perth because that's where he grew up. Australia had this weird thing at the time, I believe it was around that time, this white Australia policy. If you were white European, you could come out and no one else was allowed. But now we are very much a multicultural society, which I think actually does improve the place. But anyway, that is why a lot of English people, or at least from the United Kingdom, were coming out to Australia at the time. But importantly for this story, on John's 19th birthday, he took his girlfriend along, Rosemary Anderson. Now, she was 17 years old. And her folks said, look, you can go to that party, but John, you make sure she gets home safely because, back then chivalry was important. You took your lady out, you made sure she got home safely. But at that party, it's stated, and I've read in a few accounts of this, that a minor altercation took place between John and Rosemary. Now, I dispute that minor altercation because of what happened next. She decides she's going to walk home. Now, if it was a minor altercation, you would expect John to be able to run out and say, look, don't do that. I'm sorry. We'll sort it out later, but just enjoy the party and I'll drive you home. But no, he's had to follow her in the car because obviously he wants her to get home safe. And he's saying, look, just get in the car. She refuses, keeps, I would suggest, storming off down the road. Now, this happened a few times. And John then decides, well, I need to get myself a cigarette. So he lights one up, smokes it, then gets back in the car to find Rosemary. And at that point, he does find her. But she's lying on the side of the road. And she passes away. The police are called. They turn up on the scene. Now, John is cooperating with the police. So they feel he has nothing to hide. But they note that he's got damage to the front of his car. And his girlfriend's injuries are consistent with being hit by a car. They take him back to the police station. And he says, I'm innocent. I didn't do any of this at all. But after a little while, he breaks down and confesses to the crime. So now John Button, celebrating his 19th birthday, is spending the rest of that not in the local lockup. No, they sent him to the Fremantle prison, and not just the Fremantle prison, but death row. Yes, he was spending the night with death row inmates, because at the time, Western Australia was still carrying out the death sentence. So now you're John Button, 19 years old. You've confessed to a crime. Where they've placed you, you know your life now is in jeopardy. But for some reason, the police don't go for the death sentence. In fact, they don't even charge him, or at least at the court case, he's not found guilty of murder, but rather willful manslaughter. And he gets 10 years in prison, and he's let out after 5 years. To many people, that would be a travesty of justice. A young bloke, just all in a rage, had a fight with the girlfriend, but then runs her down, and you only serve 5 years in prison? Well, that would be a travesty. Do you think that sentence passes the pub test? Well, before you answer, there's a twist to this. And yes, this was a travesty, but not for the reason that you think. Enter Eric Cook. Now, he was born February 25th, 1931. Now, his father, Vivian, or Viv, as we'd call him, got to know this girl, Christine. They had a baby on the way before they were married, so they had what we would call a shotgun wedding. But the problem with Viv is he loved the drink way more than he loved his wife, and eventually they had 3 kids together. But the drink disagreed with Viv quite a lot, and he was definitely the violent alcoholic type. So Christine used to spend nights at her work sleeping just to avoid the violent rampages that this bloke would go on. But then what happened with the kids? They're still at home. Well, it said that Eric used to hide underneath the house some nights just to keep away from his father. Or he would be found wandering the streets. Now, with this lifestyle, I'm suggesting, and it's fairly obvious, that he didn't have a very good start in life. He also had a cleft palate, which needed surgery, but back then it didn't exactly work greatly, so he had a little bit of deformity around his mouth, and that also led to a speech impediment, which is important a little bit later. But early on in his school life, he's getting expelled for stealing money from teachers. But I sort of think, and this is really tough, but if he's an alcoholic father and the mother's not always coming home, he might have just needed that for food. Who knows? And desperate people do desperate things. But he's in and out of foster care as well throughout his life, because obviously the parents weren't really looking after their kids. But what's worse, and this is absolutely diabolical, but he's often going to the hospital with head injuries due to falling down. Yes, young Eric, he's a little bit accident prone. I think it's safe to say he was getting beat pretty bad. That's also important as we go through this story, in my opinion. But we'll see. But because of this deformity and speech impediment, he was bullied at school relentlessly. Despite the fact it said he was quite bright in some subjects, just school didn't end up being the place for him. So at the age of 14, he starts in the workforce, but he's perhaps was a little bit accident prone. He had a couple of injuries at various jobs, but then by the age of 17, he's starting to get himself involved in the life of crime. But yet, inside, he probably didn't think he was that bad, and he actually wanted to be a choir boy at the local church, and he auditioned. But probably, I would suggest, because of his speech impediment, well, he didn't make the choir. And he did not take that very well. So Eric decides to go and burn down the church. So then he goes into juvie or juvenile detention for 18 months for that crime. Now, on getting out, that didn't seem to help him much, because then he goes on a spree. He's robbing places left, right, and centre. He's not very careful about it, and he's got fingerprints on everything. So when they fingerprint him and they find out all the crimes he was doing, they lock him up for 3 years. And they've also now got plenty of evidence on file to know if this bloke is going to get into any more trouble later in life, which he does. But on getting out of prison, he joins the army, and it said that he's actually going quite well. And maybe the discipline and the order that the army offered him is what he needed in life. Someone to give him some structure. And even though he's actually getting promoted within 3 months, so he's only there for a short time and they're seeing some potential in him, they then find out about his juvie record and he gets discharged. I don't understand that. Like, you've now got this bloke getting on the straight and narrow. Would that not be the place for him? But no, they discharge him from the army. But one bright side to his army time, that they taught him how to use a gun. Yep, he was a pretty good shot too, apparently. But then at 22, he does get married and they end up, him and his wife, having 7 children all together. But then in 1963, he's in his early 30s. He goes on a bit of a spree. He's breaking into houses. He's robbing people. But sometimes he's breaking into houses and shooting people. And he doesn't even take anything. There was no point to some of these crimes. And he was targeting a very wealthy suburb in Perth where a wealthy older couple was shot in their beds. It's dreadful. But as a result, fear was gripping Perth during 1963. And this bloke became known as the Night Caller, or the Nedlands Monster. In fact, it's said that in Perth at the time, if you went to visit someone, you'd knock on the door and say, "G'day, mate, it's the Nedlands Monster," as a bit of a joke. And Nedlands is a suburb of Perth, so if you are from Perth, let me know about that. Why the name the Nedlands Monster? It's probably in the book, but I haven't read the book, which I'll talk about a bit later. But how he got caught is he'd stashed a gun in a park and the police found it. So they did a stakeout, waiting for the person to come back and get the gun. And they'd actually fingerprinted it, and they knew who belonged to the gun. Yes, it was Eric Cook. And around midnight that night, they see Cook come back, and he's loitering around the area. And then he goes to pick up the guns, and the police arrest him. Now, the police didn't mess around back then. They get him in the interrogation room and he's denying everything at this point, even though they got all this evidence against him, just like they did with John Button. But one of the investigators says, which I find quite interesting way of trying to get someone to cooperate. This is what he's apparently told in the interrogation room. And just quickly, yes, his name is spelt with an E, Eric Cook. But in Australia, if you're called Cook, even without the E, your nickname will be Cookie. This is what the interrogator said. He said, "Cookie, you're going to hang, you know. There's no doubt about it. You got a wife and kids. Think of them. And then think of whether you're going to be dragged to the gallows like a mongrel dog or you're going to go there like a man." Well, apparently that did the trick. And he confesses to all of the crimes. 8 murders and 14 attempted murders. Now, he does go to trial and he pleads not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution get a doctor to investigate him, check him out, and they say, no, he's perfectly sane. They don't allow the defense to get a second expert witness. Now, I will say expert witnesses are absolutely ridiculous because if I've got this pen, does it come up? Oh, yeah, I'm just looking. Yeah, you can see it's blue. But no, I don't want it to be blue. I want it to be red. So I'll get an expert witness, and you know what? They're going to tell me that it's red because I've paid them money, and they'll convince you that it's red. But the other person's saying, no. I'm going to convince you that it's black. So both sides will come up with an argument, but all along, somewhere in the middle's true. It's blue. You see that in cases all the time. So whether or not they were just saying, look, you're naturally going to get someone to say that he's insane, so we just don't need to hear it. But it does seem a bit odd that he was not allowed to present that evidence. Now, I haven't mentioned the victims at all here because there were way too many. But he's only actually convicted of the murder of one person, John Sturkey. And all the others were held in abeyance. And the reason for that is, found guilty on this, he's going to be executed. So there's no point in dragging these trials out any longer than they necessarily were going to be. Because back then, you were not on death row for very long. If you were sentenced, they carried that out quite quickly. And yes, he is found guilty of that charge of murder of John Sturkey. And yes, he is sent to the Fremantle prison, to the death row section, the same spot that John Button had been only 12 months before, when his girlfriend Rosemary Anderson was found on the side of the road. Now, interestingly, his lawyers said, we've got grounds for appeal. We can go pretty hard here. And he says no. Like Eric Cook says no. Let's not. I should pay for what I've done. It was the 26th of October, 1964 was the date for his execution. And 10 minutes before that event, he puts his hand on a Bible and swears to the fact that he was the one who killed Rosemary Anderson, not John Button. He also confesses to another murder that happened that someone else also was still serving a sentence for. Why was he swearing on the Bible? Because he'd made these claims previously and the police just said, we don't want to hear it. We've already arrested the two blokes who did both those crimes. You're just making it up. Now, again, I would say there's something here. Because H.H. Holmes, who people claim was the world's largest serial killer, and I totally dispute that. If you want to check out those videos on the pub test, look them up, because that is a myth. And he was confessing to crimes that he didn't even do. He confessed to a murder of someone who was still alive. And so these people, when they're on death row, maybe want to make a bigger name for themselves. They've got nothing else to lose. So I'll confess to this, I'll confess to that. And who knows, maybe he'd run into John Button and this other bloke in prison. Who knows? Perhaps they could mingle. And he said, I'll confess to that, then you'll get out, mate. We don't know. Well, that's why the police, though, could have been thinking along those lines. But still, his execution was carried out. And intriguingly, and here's just a little statement, he was the last person in Western Australia to receive the death sentence. Nobody has since 1964. But John Button is still in prison for the murder, or manslaughter, I should say, of his girlfriend, Rosemary Anderson. And you would say, does this pass the pub test that he committed that crime? Considering the weight of evidence, they had a confession of John Button that he ran his girlfriend over. They had the damage to the front of his car. Like, they'd had a fight. Could you take the confession of someone on death row seriously? Well, here is a bit more of a twist. Let's look at the interrogation of John Button first. Now, remembering, he's a 19-year-old kid. Now, if you're a 19-year-old bloke out there watching this, going, I'm not a kid, I'm a man now. Let me tell you, it's a little bit of a secret. You're not. You're still a kid. You're still growing up. Blokes tend to not really grow up properly, they reckon, until you're about 30 years old, so they say. And you'll look back and go, I get it now, once you get past that. So here's this 19-year-old kid seeing the trauma of his girlfriend on the side of the road, and he's dragged into the police station being accused of the crime. He's got no lawyer with him. His parents were sitting outside in the hallway. They're expecting to take him home and help him deal with the trauma of that whole situation. And much to their shock, he doesn't. He's off to the prison, being held on death row. But he confessed during that interrogation, so surely that would prove that he did it. But there were no cameras back then in those interrogation rooms, and John Button would later claim that they put him under some immense pressure, not just psychological warfare. No, they did not do that. Apparently he was struck at least once very hard. So they've physically beat him into this confession. Well, what about the car damage? He had damage to the front of his car. Now, if that's not enough evidence, then what is? And yet, the police knew that he had reported the fact he'd been in an accident 3 weeks before this event happened, and they knew that the car had damage to the front. And the damage was not consistent with running someone over. It was consistent with a car accident. As I said, those cars back then, they were pretty solid. You run over a person, I don't even think you'd make a dent. You might just do a little fender if they weren't made of steel. But the police knew of this damage, and yet they ignored it. They also had the confession of Eric Cook, and they ignored it. Now, maybe he only served 5 years because they realised, well, maybe the weight of evidence isn't as strong as they thought. And Eric Cook gave a detailed description of that event and even the car he was driving. He said, I was driving an EK Holden on that particular night. And it turns out that EK Holden, when they looked into it, had received some damage and needed some repair. Exactly at the same time when this event happened. But still, John Button sat in prison for a few more years. But you'd think, well, you get out, you've only done 5 years, perhaps it's not that bad. Just imagine now living your life. Yes, you're out of prison, but you still are a convicted killer, even though it's manslaughter. You've got to live your life with that. Now, John Button does get married and has children, and he does talk about the trauma of that whole situation, and it was a massive, massive struggle for him. But then a writer, she's an author, she's published as well, Estelle Blackburn, wrote about not only John Button, but another person who I'm not mentioning in this one, who was also serving in prison for a crime that Eric Cook had confessed to. And she wrote about it in this book, Broken Lives. And even though she's no lawyer, she raised some very, very good arguments to prove that John Button was innocent, as well as the other bloke. They got a crash test dummy expert out from the United States, and they tested if you hit someone in the car that John Button was driving or the EK Holden that Eric Cook said he was driving, guess what? It was the EK Holden. The way the person was found, the way they would have fallen, and the damage to the vehicles was consistent with that. And so it wasn't until 2002 that John Button had his conviction quashed. So finally, after almost 40 years, he was now proven to be an innocent man. Now, it's said that Rosemary Anderson's parents did not agree with this. They believed that he was responsible, and the authorities had to go and prove this to them. And they finally accepted that John Button was not responsible, but they still felt that he had some responsibility in the sense that it was his job to get her home safe, and he didn't do that. And that's something that he would still have to live with regardless, but he did not do the crime that he was sent to prison for. And John Button now spearheads the Western Australian Innocence Project, helping others who have been wrongly convicted to prove their innocence and get out of prison. And as I understand, as of recording, March 2025, he's still doing that. But what do you think of this one? Now, I am completely torn on this from so many different points of view. It was an absolute travesty what happened to John Button, with the police knowing the evidence that they had. But the thing is, the police would also know that cars wouldn't get all that badly damaged by hitting someone back then. So they probably thought it really doesn't matter. The evidence is clear that John Button did it, so we're going to make sure that he pays the price. I could see that, but is that the best way of policing? I would suggest no. But what about Eric Cook himself? What he did was absolutely atrocious. His upbringing was woeful, but you can't blame the upbringing solely because he had two other siblings and they didn't end up going on these sprees. Yes, he obviously got hit around the head, and in this day and age, we understand the damage that can do to people. Look at all the football players and wrestlers and boxers. Some of them have snapped. Not all of them do. But a small minority just lose it. And I would suggest that's what happened here with Eric Cook. So did he deserve the death sentence, or would he have been better served life in prison without parole? For sure, but learn more about these things. Understand it so that maybe you can stop it from happening in the future. I just don't know. Let me know what you think of that. But I do understand in the 1960s times were different, and I will say, because I have not been able to really give justice to the victims in these cases at all. And I would suggest that if you were a family member of one of those victims, you might say, well, justice was definitely served and, like good riddance, and I would understand that point of view as well. But that's what the pub test is for. Putting out different opinions, having that conversation. So let me know what you think of this one. But I will be doing more cases like this one with those twists and turns that they intrigue me. And so I'm going to be telling these stories. Next video out is a return to a Jack the Ripper side of things. Look out for that video. Thank you for watching. YouTube, tell me I should say, give us a like, give us a subscribe, but particularly for all of you who are sharing these videos, thank you so much for that. I'm Owen, you've been watching The Pub Test, and we will see you on the next one.